Welcome to the National Institute of Corrections Restrictive Housing Training for Prisons. This brief presentation focuses on the history of restrictive housing. There are two learning objectives for this presentation. The first is to recognize the historical purpose for restrictive housing and its characteristics. The second learning objective is to describe the shift in the purpose of restrictive housing from reform to punishment. There are several opportunities at the conclusion of the presentation to check in and see if these learning objectives were met. This quote by William C. Collins suggests that restrictive housing can serve a purpose within corrections. The fact that extremely restrictive conditions place it at the very edge of what is constitutionally permissible suggests that, with properly developed policies and procedures, it can function in a constitutionally acceptable fashion. For restrictive housing to adhere to the Constitution, correctional agencies should ensure there are policies and procedures in place. Starting in 1787, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was the first facility to use individual cells to house inmates. Both males and females could be placed in solitary cells with various restrictions, including restrictions on food, limited to no opportunities for work or recreation, and often the cells did not include beds or other furniture. Quakers believed that isolation was a time for reflection and remorse. The Walnut Street Jail became a model for the Pennsylvania system. There was typically no clear indicator as to when an inmate would be released. Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania opened its doors in 1829. Prison reform was one reason as to why Eastern State was built. Isolation was viewed as the mechanism to reform, and isolation served as a shift from public punishment to providing the inmate with privacy for the purposes of remorse and reflection in isolation. It was the intention of prison reformers to build a healthy environment for inmates in isolation. In many respects, this was done to improve upon the unhealthy conditions at Walnut Street. To support this model of isolation, inmates wore masks when outside of their cells. Their cells were equipped with feed doors to limit interactions with staff when food was being provided. There were individual exercise yards to limit communication with other inmates. The overall structure and design was to prohibit contact amongst inmates and minimize contact with officers. In 1890, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on a case concerning inmate James Medley. James was convicted of murdering his wife and sentenced to die by hanging. James spent 45 days in solitary confinement, which the courts deemed inhumane, and he was subsequently released. A finding from the ruling indicated that solitary confinement, even for short periods, does not yield favorable results, and in general, offenders are not reformed upon release from solitary confinement. Further, the justices noted that mental health issues were found across inmates placed in solitary confinement. As a result of this case, the purpose of restrictive housing shifted from reflection and remorse, which serves as a corrective measure, to punishment. Alcatraz was designed to incarcerate prisoners who displayed multiple disciplinary issues within other federal facilities. Dangerous inmates were housed in the treatment unit, also known as D Block. Prior to D Block being converted to a lockdown unit, A Block was being used for segregation. Cells within A Block were considered dungeons by the inmates. Within D Block, inmates were locked in their cells for approximately 24 hours a day, with 1 hour of recreation yard per week. There were 36 segregation cells and 6 solitary confinement cells at Alcatraz. In March 1963, Alcatraz Penitentiary was closed. Following the closure of Alcatraz in 1963, many prisoners once housed at Alcatraz were eventually transferred to Marion. Within Marion's solitary confinement was a behavior modification program known as CARE, or the Control and Rehabilitation Effort. This program was sharply criticized for not being focused on the rehabilitation of inmates, but rather was a program model often described as quite abusive. By 1973, Marion had established control unit blocks with 23 to 24 hours a day spent in isolation within single cells. In 1983, 2 correctional officers were killed on the same day by 2 inmates, both of whom were affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood. The result was a facility-wide lockdown, which lasted 23 years. The goal of this facility-wide lockdown was to protect staff from inmates and inmates from other inmates. In 1988, a federal appeals court upheld the lockdown and ruled that the whole here is depressing in the extreme, but we are not persuaded that any relaxation in the controls instituted in the fall of 1983 is constitutionally required, given the extraordinary security problems at the prison. The controls are a unitary and integrated system for dealing with the nation's least corrigible inmates. Piecemeal dismantling would destroy the system's rationale and impair its efficiency. Marion served as a template for the new American Supermax, and by 2006, USP Marion was transformed to a medium security facility. Located in California, Pelican State Bay Prison was designed to house the state's most violent and serious offenders. Half of Pelican Bay is comprised of general population, while the other half is dedicated to the Secure Housing Unit, or SHU. 8 by 10-foot windowless cells within the SHU are made of smooth poured concrete with perforated cell fronts and doors. Inmates are in their cells for approximately 22 hours a day. Officers can permit 1 or 2 inmates, if they are cellmates, out of their assigned cell to shower or exercise. Inmates are offered up to 10 hours of outdoor exercise each week within a cement yard. To support reintegration back into general population, there are 96 beds within the B facility at Pelican Bay used for a transitional program. Inmates sent from SHU to the B facility may still pose safety concerns to staff as well as other inmates. Opened in 1994, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, or ADX, was intended to be the Supermax facility to replace Marion. Commonly referred to as Alcatraz of the Rockies, the penitentiary was designed as a state-of-the-art facility to house the worst of the worst. Inmates spend approximately 23 hours a day in their cell. When transferred outside the cell, multiple staff will escort the inmate. The construction of ADX was dedicated toward reducing the potential of violence against staff and other inmates, but it also limits communication amongst inmates and other staff. The overall structure of ADX was intended to make escape virtually impossible. This next section focuses on the presentation learning check-in. Please feel free to read along and identify the correct response to each question. What was the purpose of restrictive housing for the Walnut Street Jail and Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania? A. Reflection. B. Remorse. C. Punishment. D. A and B are both correct. The correct answer is D. Both A and B are correct. What were the common characteristics of restrictive housing for Walnut Street Jail and Eastern State Penitentiary? A, individualized cells, B, individual exercise yards, C, cells had feed doors, D, all of the above. The correct answer is D, all of the above. How did the purpose of restrictive housing change in 1890? A, the purpose shifted from reflection and remorse to punishment. B, the purpose shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. C, the purpose shifted from rehabilitation to punishment. D, none of the above are true. The correct answer is A, the purpose shifted from reflection and remorse to punishment. Why did the purpose of restrictive housing shift from remorse and reflection to punishment? A Supreme Court ruling found that solitary confinement was inhumane. B, a Supreme Court case noted that in general, most individuals were not reformed upon exiting solitary confinement. C, both A and B are true. The correct response is C. The Supreme Court ruled that solitary confinement was inhumane and that most individuals were not reformed as a result of confinement within solitary. Thank you for joining the History of Restrictive Housing presentation.